Hello anatomy students. Today we're going to start our second half of the skin and body membranes unit by talking about body membranes. And so we've spent a lot of time talking about different kinds of tissue, epithelial tissue and connective tissue, and it was important for you to understand the different types of these tissues because now we're going to use that to explain the structure and the function of various membranes that are found in the body. So as you can see in my flow chart here, we have in blue epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So those two combined together are going to form body membranes, and there are four of them that we're going to talk about today. We will talk about mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous membranes, and synovial membranes. And so this is the diagram that you're going to see in the upper corner here, just so that you can kind of follow along. Okay, so very briefly, what I have here are the structures of each of the four types of body membranes that we're going to cover today. So our mucous membranes are made up of epithelial tissue and also of loose connective tissue, or a type of areolar tissue. But in mucous membranes, this areolar tissue has a name called the lamina propria, which is something that you'll need to know. Serous membranes are made of an epithelium, so an epithelial layer, lying on top of areolar tissue. The cutaneous membrane has an epithelial layer lying on top of areolar tissue as well as dense irregular connective tissue. And then finally, the synovial membranes are comprised of an atypical epithelium, so that's not really something that we've talked about yet, but one thing that you'll find in this class is that there's always an exception to the rule. And this atypical epithelium lies on top of areolar tissue. So these three, our mucous membranes, serous membranes, and cutaneous membranes, they can be considered epithelial membranes because they do contain an epithelial layer. But I don't want you to be short-sighted. Remember that membranes require two types of tissues, an epithelial layer and a connective tissue layer below. The synovial membrane, since it's got this atypical epithelium, it's not considered an epithelial membrane. Rather, this is considered a connective tissue, which I'll just abbreviate with CT, a connective tissue membrane. Okay, so let's start talking about our mucous membranes. Our mucous membranes, like I said, consists of an epithelial layer. Now, we studied a lot of different kinds of epithelial layers, right? Like we talked about simple squamous, stratified squamous. We talked about, pseudostratified columnar. We talked about simple cuboidal. So, what kind of epithelium are we actually talking about here? Well, that's going to vary according to the location of the mucous membrane. But at any rate, our epithelial layer, whatever it is lying on top of loose connective tissue, which we are calling the lamina propria. And that's what you can see in the diagram here. So the lamina propria, which is the areolar tissue or the loose connective tissue layer, is going to support the epithelial layer, whatever it is. Now, mucous membranes are special because they will line body cavities that are open to the exterior. So our body cavities that have contact with our external environment. So this would include our respiratory system, right? Because our nose, our nasal passages have contact with the air that we are inhaling. That would include our digestive system. We have a mouth that is lined with mucous membranes, and the whole of our digestive system is lined with mucus secreting membrane, mucous membrane, all the way down to the anus. And then our urinary system also is lined with mucous membranes too. Now, oftentimes, the type of cell that is responsible for the secretion of this mucus is a goblet cell, and I know that you read about that in the last chapter that we were looking at. And in this picture here, we can see this cell is a goblet cell. It's called a goblet cell just because of its structure here. And then inside are the tiny little pockets of mucus that cell is secreting. I do want to mention, however, that not all of our mucous membranes are going to secrete mucus. So like I said, the respiratory membrane obviously does. You know, you have to blow your nose sometimes. That's mucus. The digestive system secretes quite a bit of mucus that is necessary to push and propel the food that we eat through the tubes of our body. But our our urinary system, the membrane that lines it, does not secrete mucus. In fact, in a urinalysis, if a patient shows a great deal of mucus or even just a little bit of mucus in the sample, that is indicative of an infection of some kind. So there should not be any mucus normally in the urine. So that's what I've got for you for mucous membranes. Next, let's talk about our serous membranes. So our serous membranes will line cavities of our body that are closed to the outside. So where the mucous membranes were lining cavities that were open to our environment, serous membranes are going to line cavities that are completely closed off. The epithelial layer of these membranes is usually a simple squamous epithelium. In this picture, they're calling it mesothelium, but don't worry about this term at all. So we can just know that it is a simple squamous epithelium. And that simple squamous epithelium, so that single layer of flat epithelial cells, is supported again by areolar tissue. The serous membranes are closed to the outside, like I said, and they are going to occur in pairs. So one of the membranes is going to make contact with the body wall, usually of the ventral body cavity, and the second layer of the membrane is going to make contact with the tissue of the organs itself. So let me show you a picture of this. This is showing us the arrangement of the serosa. And so the organ that I'm using as an example here is the heart. And you can see that I've got this double membrane, but you know, you can see that it's kind of, it really is the same one, right? Like it just kind of folds over on itself. Like there's not a distinct beginning and end to each part of it. So that's a detail to remember. But the part here that is actually touching the heart muscle, this is called the visceral serous membrane, while the part that is over here on the outside, this is the part here that would actually make contact with the body wall. That would be called the parietal serous membrane. And if I can tear your eyes away from that picture for a minute so that you can look at this one where you have like a mostly deflated balloon, and this person is like mashing their fist into the balloon. The part that actually touches the skin of this person's fist, that is like the visceral serous membrane, and the part that is on the outside of it is like the parietal serous membrane. Now in the balloon, you have some space here that's filled with air, and that's not the case when we're talking about the actual membranes in the body. Actually, the space in between, which is called a cavity, is actually filled with serous fluid. All right, so as I've been talking, you're probably like, well, wait a minute, you keep saying visceral serous membrane and parietal serous membrane, but here on our slide, it says the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. Well, I wanted to tell you the general terms first because the names of these serous membranes are going to change depending upon where they are found in the body. So, for instance, for the serous membrane that actually surrounds the heart, this whole thing with the visceral pericardium and the pericardial cavity and the parietal pericardium, like all together, this is also known, and you may have heard of this, as the pericardial sac. And when you dissect a heart, it actually looks like a brown paper bag that's attached up here at the base of the heart. And in order for you to actually see the heart tissue, you have to cut away the pericardial sac to expose the actual cardiac muscle. But I digress. So this is all together called the pericardial sac. And since this is around the heart, we don't call it the visceral serous membrane, we call it the visceral pericardium. The part that is touching the body wall is called the parietal pericardium. And then the cavity in between the two layers is called the pericardial cavity. Now, I mentioned that the pericardial cavity and any of the cavities that are found in between the visceral and parietal serous membranes, they're not filled with air, they are filled with fluid. That fluid is going to be created by the actual connective tissue that is found inside of that membrane. So the reason why we have this membrane here is to surround organs that move around a lot. Like your heart is constantly pumping and moving, your lungs are expanding and contracting. You need these organs to be covered by this fluid-filled bag, actually, in order to reduce the amount of friction that they experience, not just between the organ and the body wall itself, but between multiple organs that are found in the same area. And so that is the purpose of these membranes. Now, around the heart, it's called the pericardium. In the abdomen, it's called the peritoneum. So I just wrote that out for you there. And these are called the pleural membranes around the lungs. So pleural. And so that's what I've got for you for our serous membranes. The next membrane to talk about, and this is the final epithelial membrane that we will discuss, and I'm not going to discuss it at length because after this we're going to really hop into talking about the skin and how it's composed and what are the other parts to the skin that help it to perform its functions. But our cutaneous membrane is made of 2 layers. We have the epithelium on top. We are going to have some some areolar tissue here in the center, and then our dermis, or the lower level of skin, is made up of dense irregular connective tissue. Now remember, dense irregular connective tissue has a lot of collagen in it. It has some elastic fibers in it, but those fibers are arranged in various directions, and that's going to provide strength and stretchability to our skin. So it's going to be able to tolerate stresses in a lot of different directions without sustaining damage. Now, there are a couple of things here that I just wanted to make sure that we covered. The epithelium is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and what that means is that the cells that are found in our epithelium contain a protein called keratin, and keratin makes them very tough and also waterproof. And that's a really important thing, because if we weren't waterproof from the keratin that's found in our skin, every time we'd come out of the shower, we would be like puffed up, like one of those little sponge things that you can buy at the grocery store, like when you put the quarter in and you turn the little thing and it comes out in a plastic dome, and it's like really small and tiny, and then you put this little sponge thing under the water and it just puffs up. Like that's what we would do if we weren't waterproof, but thankfully we are, so we can emerge from the shower in pretty much the same shape that we were when we went into the shower. So we're going to talk more about that a little bit later. But the cutaneous membrane is also different from all of the other 2 epithelial membranes that we talked about: the mucous membrane, and the serous membranes. Those 2 are they're more like wet, they're moist, there are secretions, but our cutaneous membrane is dry, and that's different. That's a difference that the cutaneous membrane possesses from its sister epithelial membranes. But like I said, we're going to talk more about the skin in a lot of detail after this lecture, so stay tuned for more. Okay. So that was the last of our epithelial membranes. Now we're going to move on to take a look at our last membrane, which is the synovial membrane. And for those of you who have maybe visited a physical therapist or an occupational therapist, or maybe you've sustained some kind of joint injury, you may know this word, that, synovial membrane. You may not know exactly what it does, but it's a part of joints. So a joint is where the ends of 2 bones come together or articulate, and the ends of the bones are covered by a capsule, which is what you see in our diagram right up here. Synovial membrane is made up of an atypical epithelium, and it's going to lie on top of areolar tissue. The atypical epithelium has cells that are not in such close contact with their neighbors. The development is a little bit different. It's going to develop within connective tissue. And atypical epithelium has no basement membrane. So even in the skin, the bottom layer of the epidermis and cells that are in the upper layer of the dermis, they're going to release components to create this basement membrane, which kind of glues the top layer of skin to the bottom layer of the skin. But in our synovial membrane, we don't do that. We don't have that. Like I said, the cells are not going to be in close contact with each other. There's going to be these large gaps in between the cells. And that's a really important point, especially within the joints. a large component of our joints is cartilage. And cartilage is basically a lot of collagen, not a lot of matrix, and then our chondrocytes, or our cartilage cells, are just embedded within these proteins. And cartilage is avascular. So how are these cells that are embedded there going to get the oxygen and the nutrients that they need in order to stay alive? They get it through diffusion. And so we have some blood vessels that are found within our synovial membrane. Oxygen and nutrients can diffuse out of our little capillaries, which we have here, and then it enters into the synovial fluid, which bathes the ends of these bones. And then it can diffuse to the chondrocytes that are found in the articular hyaline cartilage here and here. But that diffusion couldn't occur if we had typical epithelial tissue lining the synovial membrane. Those cells are too close together. They wouldn't allow for these molecules to get out. But if you look here, like here's like a group of about 3 cells, and then you have a big gap, and then here's a group of 3 cells and a big gap. So those gaps are going to allow for the oxygen and the nutrients to leave the capillaries and to go to the hyaline cartilage and the cells that are there. So it's the cells that are found in the areolar tissue that are actually synthesizing and secreting the synovial fluid. And those are the major things that I wanted to make sure that I told you about the synovial membrane. So I think I hit them all. So just to recap, 4 different membranes are what you need to know. 3 of them are epithelial membranes. They are the mucous membranes, which line cavities that are open to the environment. Serous membranes, which line cavities that are closed to the environment. And you have the cutaneous membrane, which separates our innards from the environment itself. And the cutaneous membrane is our skin, and it is special in that it is a dry membrane. It's not moist. The last membrane is the one that we just finished up. This is a connective tissue membrane. It's called the synovial membrane, and it is found surrounding the bones that make up our joints. All right, everybody, that's all that I have for you today. Thank you for watching my video. I hope that you learned something, and I'll see you in class. Bye.